In this video, I want to talk about assembly styles. So if I click on assembly and leave it on the assembly dropdown, which means cabinet construction, there's a style option here with a dropdown with 4 options. And so I want to talk through just a few of the cabinet options and then switch to the drawer box rollouts and talk about those options. So our very first option in the list is 32 millimeter. And this is essentially a frameless cabinet. And you might look at this and say, well, shouldn't I pick frameless if I want a frameless cabinet? And the answer is no. I don't know why frameless is still an option in here. Basically, if you pick frameless, it will look like a frameless box, but it doesn't drill any of the line bores or any of the hose. So I can't think of a good reason why anyone would ever use frameless, but obviously someone still uses it because it's still there. So for 99% of you, you will never use frameless. If you do want to make a frameless box, you will be using 32 millimeter. So now, it's important to note that as I change these style dropdowns, it's changing the questions that become available. So if I switch to face frame, you'll see it unlocks a new field, and there's a few questions scattered throughout here that also unlocked. So back to the top of our list, 32 millimeter is our face frame that also has machining and line boring, which is great. So we know what that is. Face frame, very similar to frame overlay. Both face frame and frame overlay will unlock the face frame questions, and we can build a nice face frame cabinet. So the big difference between face frame and frame overlay is how it deals with sizing the doors. So on standard face frame, it will look at your hinge settings and look at what the overlay needs to be and size your doors based upon that. So for example, let's say we're doing a standard overlay construction that just has 1/2 inch overlays top, bottom, left, and right. So face frame style would be the best option for that. Because with face frame, it would look at the hinge, see that it needs a 1/2 inch on the left and right and the top and bottom, and make the door 1/2 inch bigger all the way around. Now the other good use for the face frame style is when we're doing inset, because we can put in -3/32 or -1/8, whatever inset reveals we want, and it will size it based off of the opening and based off what it sees in your inset hinge. Okay, so that's our 2 uses for face frame. Now frame overlay is a little bit different. You can pick a 1/2 inch overlay hinge or an 1.25 inch overlay hinge, and this construction method will ignore the hinge settings. Instead, it will look at the reveals section and know that you want an 1/8 inch on the top, an 1/8 inch in between drawers, and an 1/8 inch on the bottom, or whatever you set here in the reveals section. It's going to do its best to make the reveals consistent rather than making the overlays consistent. So there's pros and cons to each method, but your goal is you want to make as few manual changes as possible. So if you're doing a full overlay face frame construction, you probably want to use this frame overlay. But if you're doing inset or what I would call a standard overlay or a partial overlay, then you might want to look at using the frame style. And then to sum up, like we mentioned at the beginning, frameless, in my opinion, is obsolete and will not be usable in 99% of cases. In this video, we're going to talk about construction branches. Branches can be made for base cabinets, wall cabinets, tall cabinets, or even corner cabinets. And so, for example, branches are how we have stretchers on the top of a base cabinet and full tops on the top of a wall cabinet. And notice I also have a full top on my corner cabinets. So let's go look at how we set up branches to accomplish that. So if I go to exterior case and go to top, each question in the construction method has the opportunity to have branches. So if I click through and find the question for what type of top, you'll see that my branches are set up. So default means base cabinets. Now, like on this question, default means everything because there's no overrides, no other branches. But on this question, it means base cabinets and everything else not specified. So that's why my base cabinets are using top stretchers. Standard 90, that's why my corner cabinet for base cabinets is using a full top. And then we have uppers and tall using tops. Now you do want to be careful with branches because you don't want more branches than you need. So what I would try to avoid is, if you have vanity as a section and it's the same as your default, that's really just making it harder to maintain. So if it's unnecessary, you should remove it to make it easier to maintain and see what's happening. The only time you should have branches is if it's different than the default. So let's look at another example. If I look at a question on the deck, and I find this distance from the bottom of the deck to the edge of the case, If I would want to add a branch, I hit the plus arrow, and here's all the options that I have. Now, this is strictly type-based. So it's either the type of cabinet or the type of corner cabinet. And this by itself does give us a lot of controls and helps us fit all the different scenarios that's going to come up in our construction method. In the next video, we're going to talk about conditions, which we can even add more functionality and unlock more questions. In this video, I want to introduce you to construction conditions. And I've recently started using this a lot more, and there's so much power behind construction conditions. Because in the past, what a lot of people would do, let's say for example, I wanted to have a vertical grain construction and a horizontal grain construction. And not necessarily on the doors, but like on the actual cabinet. In the past, you'd have like a frameless construction, and then you just copy it and make a frameless horizontal construction. And sometimes that may be the better option, but I want to show you an example how we could do that using a sidebar attribute to control vertical grain or horizontal grain, and then we'll set it up using conditions. So before I start that example, let me take you into the construction method and show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to go to cabinet and modify for this room, and we have this option called conditions, which it doesn't look that exciting just right at first, but let me give you an example. So I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to say Myron test, and then what's the condition if Myron test equals true. Obviously, this is just a made-up situation. When I get to the real-life example, this is going to make more sense. But even with this, now if I would go into my top and I would want to add a condition, just like we can add branches for our different types, now we just unlocked a new option so that when this condition is true, now I can answer this question differently. So let's go back to that horizontal and vertical grain situation that I mentioned, and let's look at a real-life example. So I'm actually going to close out of this job and go create a new room sidebar attribute. So I'm going to go to utilities, parameters, and I'm going to say grain direction, and then I'll just make up a parameter name, room grain direction. And then I'm going to just select this and copy it so that I can use it in my condition. And I'm going to make it an integer and put it in a drop-down list. Vertical equals 1, horizontal equals 2. And I'm not focused on, we'll have a whole section talking about how to build these parameters. So for now, I'm more talking about construction conditions than I am about attributes right now. So just bear with me and we'll get to that when it's time. So this will add a attribute to the sidebar at the room level. And I should have two options. So if it's vertical grain, the value will be 1. If it's horizontal grain, the value will be 2. So let's go into a job with our frameless construction selected. Put something on the walls. Okay, so my go is, we see this, it defaulted to vertical because that's what I put first in my list, and then I have horizontal as an option. So my go is, when I choose horizontal here, my finished ends and unfinished ends will become horizontal grain. So let's go into our construction method and set up our first condition. I'm going to click new, and I'm going to say horizontal grain. You'll want to create a label that's obvious that okay, because I have two options. I have vertical grain and horizontal grain, so why would I name it just horizontal grain? Why wouldn't I put grain direction? Well, it's because the only thing I can check for is one situation to be true. So for me, I want vertical grain to be my default. That means all the questions that I answer without any conditions, I'm going to assume it's vertical grain. So the only time I want to start overriding a few questions is when this horizontal grain is selected. So you have to find a way to check if one specific thing is true instead of saying, well, just use my attribute on the sidebar. So that's a little bit of something to get used to. So now I'll pull in this attribute name that I copied, and when is horizontal grain true? Well, if it's equal to 2. Remember, I assigned this parameter to 1 if it was vertical grain and 2 if it was horizontal grain. Okay, now the real test comes when I go to exterior case and finished in. And there's a question here that says select the grain direction that is used for a finished in. So like I mentioned, I want to assume vertical grain by default. But if this condition is true, then I want it to be horizontal grain. So let's see if that works. Bingo. And if I go back to vertical, there we go. Normally when you do things through the construction method, the cabinet knows how to rebuild itself. I'm not sure what's going on with my toe kick there. I'm not worried about that for right now. So you can see how there's a lot of power in this. Okay, so aside from the little bug with the toe notch, which I think is actually, I remember reading on the forum, is actually a bug in 2023.4. But again, that's not the point of the video. What I'm trying to show is the power of the construction conditions. And so there's really a lot of opportunities to use conditions to try to cut down on the amount of constructions you have. Because for myself, I would much rather do something like this rather than have a frameless and a frameless horizontal grain construction. And think of the other ways you might be able to use this. Like, say for example, you sometimes want to do 3/4 backs and you want that to be plant on instead of dadoed in. So you could have an attribute on the sidebar that says back type, and you might be able to select between 1 or 2 or 3 different options, rather than having frameless with plant on backs, frameless with dadoed backs, frameless with backs and nailers. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of opportunities to use conditions. There are times when it is easier to just make a whole new construction method, and that's okay. But if you find yourself just doing one thing different, like for example the grain direction or the back type, if you find it just a few questions that are going to be different, I would try to find a way to use conditions so that your library stays super clean and it becomes very manageable as you go to new versions and as you're training new people in. You don't have to have them choosing between 10 or 12 different construction methods or more. I've seen shops with a whole lot of. So hopefully that kind of opens your eyes to what you can do with conditions, and you can start brainstorming how you can start cutting back on your construction methods. One of the common things you might get into, depending on how you're constructing your cabinets, is the need to be able to flip the machining. So for example, I'm using a blind dado construction. And a lot of people will try to limit two-sided machining so they don't have to flip the sheets in the CNC. So what if, for example, I wanted to dado my back into my bottom? Let me just go do that real quick. Connections for unfinished back, and I'm going to find unfinished back and deck, and I'm going to put a 1/4 inch dado. Okay, so that's all well and good, but now if you'll notice, if I get a red line here, when I cut this on the CNC, it will have to machine from this direction. Just draw a little arrow, because it has to groove out, come up for the blind dado, and then carry on. But then here, it would have to machine from this direction in order to cut that dado. And so Cabinet Vision has done some really good things with the 6-sided or 6-phase machining, where you cut the backside, flip the entire sheet, and then it routes it out. I think it works pretty flawless, but obviously people like to limit that as much as possible, because if you'd be doing it on every cabinet, it would get to be a lot of back-sided machining. So some people might say, well, I'll just flip my blind dado around. That way everything's coming from the top. So let's look at how we can do that. And this would apply for anything that is a one-sided operation. So if you're using cabineos, blind dados, or different connectors where there's an obvious top and bottom side, like a regular dado or even say blind dado, this will not make a difference. It's just something that has an obvious difference in the top and bottom side. So let's go back to our room settings, edit our construction, and I'm going to find the question for deck. And this question is always at the end of these general questions. It'll say, which face do you want the machining on the deck? And we can say interior. And now if we go back to our cabinet, now this is flipped around. So now my arrow becomes flipped around, and now I'm machining both from this side. Now I'm not saying that's the obvious answer, because sometimes it's worthwhile to have double-sided machining if it's a good reason, because arguably we don't like how this would be routing all the way to the outside of the part. I like a good contained dado. And what I mean by that is that blind dado route now technically comes out of the edge of the part. But I wanted to show this example because this is a very common thing that I set up for people, especially if they're using qualified blind dado or the cabineo or that type of connection. And so with any part, whether it's drawer stretchers, tops, backs, you have the ability to change which side or which direction these are facing. So if we go back into our construction, and just remember it's in this general section in interior and exterior. So if I wanted to go to my top, again, it's almost always the very last question, and it'll ask, which face do you want machining? Now, don't get it confused with the question about which way you want to face up or face down if it's one-sided. That's different than the machining question. So hopefully that clears that up and gives you some ideas if you're needing to flip it to cut down on the double-sided machining. So far in this construction, in this material schedule, I've been using two-sided materials, which if you can use two-sided materials, it really cuts down on the complexity of your construction method. But in this video, I want to go back and create some one-sided materials, assign it to my material schedule, and then talk about some of the things that you'll probably need to switch and you'll need to think about. So let's close out of this job and let's go assign some one-sided materials. So if I go to material and go to UV, well, I do have a 1/2 inch one-sided UV, which is good, but I don't have a one-sided 3/4 UV. So let me go ahead and copy this. The copy button doesn't work whenever I click on a filter, but if I double click into this, it will let me copy from here. And I'll just give it a name called 3/4 one-sided. And then I need to change my finishes because now I have a backside edge here. And remember, we have this gray finish color called plywood backside. And then I would obviously want to change my texture to this backside ply too. Okay, that's good. So that will do it for UV, and now I have a couple one-sided. Let's do a one-sided cherry as well. So I'm going to copy my 3/4, and again, I can't copy from within a search filter. If I go into panel stock, then right-click and copy, it gives me the option in my right-click menu. Because there's multiple different types, there's banding, there's board stock, and there's panel stock, it won't let me copy here because it doesn't know where to place it. Now, I don't totally know why they let you do it here either, but this is a little quick tip because if you're using these searches or these filters a lot, it's nice to know this little tip to get into the properties and then copy from there. So we're going to do a 3/4 one-sided cherry, and I'm going to delete the alias. And then same thing, let's assign this plywood back finish. There we go. So we have cherry on the front, and then we have that backside gray texture, and then we have automatic on the front because we want it to blend with the room stain color, and then we have that gray color assigned to the back. Okay, now that's not enough to see this in a job yet. We need to go to material schedules, and I'm going to look at the Euro Cherry Prefinish UV. This is the only one I'm going to copy in this example. I'm going to copy, and I'm just going to call it Prefinish UV one-sided. That way I don't lose my original one. And it always puts that copy of at the beginning. Okay, so now I have the regular Prefinish UV, and then I have Prefinish UV, and then I just put one-sided. So that's going to be my example material schedule in this video. So now let's go through and replace some of this stuff with one-sided. So on my finished ends, I'm going to start using one-sided cherry. We're looking to save money, and we think we would rather use cheaper material rather than save time in the shop. I'll be careful. Okay, so interior-wise, I'm going to go to Prefinish UV, and instead of two-sided being my normal, I'll make one-sided my normal. Now, I am going to use two-sided on my adjustable shelf, but everywhere else I'm going to use one-sided. And I also want to use one-sided on my toe kick. And there we go. That should do it. Now let's go into a job and let's talk about some of the things we have to think about now that we're doing one-sided material. So I'm going to start with just a base cabinet. Okay, so we have our cherry facing out. Before I start investigating, let me switch to my correct material schedule. Prefinish UV, one-sided. Now let's take a look. So in my room material schedule, I'm going to select Prefinished UV one-sided on both standard options. Now I didn't create an exposed interior for this example, but obviously if I would have, I would change that as well. Okay, so when we look at our cabinet, now you can see my finished left in is using one-sided cherry. And this actually looks good, but I want to introduce you to some questions to help you flip things around depending on how you want it. So I'm going to start with finished in, then we'll look at a couple other parts. So if I go into room, and these are going to be in the general side of the construction method, so I'm going to go to exterior case, finished in, And there's a question here. I think I went past it. Here we go. There's a question, if you use material with one finished side, do you orient it out or in? Now, obviously out is correct, but I do want to show you if I make it in, now my backside texture is sticking out and my cherry is facing in. So like I said, obviously in the situation I'm in, I don't want that. So let me reset it. Now let's put an unfinished in on one side. So we got finished in on the left and unfinished in on the right. So now here is an example when I do want to flip it. So the finished in kind of came in correct by default. It knew I wanted to face it out. But in this case, it's seeing UV as my finished edge, and I actually want to turn that in on unfinished ends. So let's go into the construction method and do that. So we'll go interior case, unfinished in, and find the question about which face goes in or out. Here we go. We do have one finished side, so we want to orient it in. And that's because we called our UV the front side, is why this is different than the finished in. And now we have that backside texture and that gray color on the outside and our UV on the inside. So some people have a few different strategies with, when they create a one-sided UV material, they'll put the UV on the backside rather than the front back in the material library. I like to do it how I have it set up, where I always put the finished edge on the front back in the material library, because these questions are easy to flip around. And it just helps me keep track of things if I know that the finished side of whatever one-sided material I have is going to be made out of, it's going to be using the front question instead of trying to determine whether it should be front or back. So we could go through, several of these parts, because arguably, I wouldn't really want the stretchers to be face up either. Now, they're not as critical, but if I look down from the inside of the cabinet, I wouldn't want that gray color. So let's flip those. Go to exterior case for top. Turn it down. Okay, so we're making progress, and you can see my deck is upside down, so let's go change it. Exterior case, deck, and turn it up. So these are logical questions that we're answering here. And now, the only problem here is one we can't avoid, because if we want to have a UV skin, we'll have to use an applied in. So let's select that. Instead of a regular finished in, we'll do an applied finished in, and that adds a sub in and an applied panel. Now, my sub end is still backwards, so let's go update that. Cabinet, modify for this room, interior, sub end. And I want to turn it in. Okay, now I have UV skinned all the way around the inside, and my cherry one side is facing out. So I wanted to cover this in a video because I've seen plenty of times where people try to use one-sided material and then they don't realize that they can switch that around. And so, like I said, the more you can do to make it easy and obvious how this cabinet is being built, the easier it is for your designers to start designing a little bit more outside of the box cabinets whenever that situation comes up. So again, I'm a big fan of keeping things simple, and I believe using two-sided materials is one easy way to keep things simple. But if you want to use one-sided, if that's one way that you can cut back and save money, everybody has their different opinions. It's not just a matter of flipping these parts one time, because we'll get into several interesting things with operations. Because whenever the whole sheet has to be face up or one-sided, it will create backside operations a lot easier, because now it has one finished side versus two unfinished sides. Because Cabinet Vision, if you're using two-sided materials, it does a really good job flipping parts whenever it's nesting on the CNC to avoid backside operations. Whereas with one-sided material, you can't do that as much. If something is on the gray side, like if there's a hoe coming from the gray side versus a hoe coming from the UV side, it has to machine as a backside operation, because it can't just flip apart and assume you wanted it on the UV side. So definitely some complications when trying to use one-sided, but it can certainly be done, and I've certainly seen it used plenty of times. So this video should be a good starting point to help you get things oriented correctly. In this video, we're going to talk about grain direction, and we actually just discussed it briefly in the construction conditions video, but let's look a little deeper. So right now my unfinished back is vertical grain. Let's say I want to run that horizontal on base cabinets because I can get a longer piece if I start joining some cabinets. So I'm going to go to room and modify for this room. Go to the general questions for unfinished backs. And in the grain question, I'm going to make it horizontal grain, but then add branches for uppers and talls to tell it those to stay vertical. So we can see how we can use branches to answer things differently. And now all my base cabinets will use horizontal grain. There we go. There's my horizontal grain. And if I pull a wall cabinet out and just delete the doors, you can see it is vertical. Okay, so that's easy enough. Now some other things we can do is we can control the grain on the deck and the top and pretty much every part in the construction method. So let's look at a couple more examples. If I go into exterior case deck and find the question about which grain we want to use, we can put it on vertical grain. And now it's running front to back. So look at the part in the cabinet, go to the construction method in the interior or exterior section and flip the grain if you like. And if you need to add branches, you're able to do so, or even if you need to add conditions, now you know, and now you're equipped to do that. Okay, now let's talk about part banding. And we have a couple set up, but you can see we're not done, because remember how we assigned that gray finish color to the edges? And this is why. It becomes very obvious that I don't have banding on these top stretchers, but I do have on some of these other parts. Now, another example is if I put a divider in, you can see it doesn't have banding. So let's go into the construction method and see how we can manage this. So the first thing I want to do is the top stretchers. So I'm going to go to exterior case and top. And banding is almost always the very first question. Now in this case, top has a couple different options because the first question is about full tops, which is already set up correctly. I can pick between exterior banding or interior banding. And here just a little bit later, I'll show you how we can add more options to this dropdown. So now it's going to say define banding for the front top stretcher. Well, I do want banding on it. And then it's going to ask, well, about the rear stretcher. This could go either way, but I'm going to go ahead and put banding on it as well. And now when we go look at our changes, now our stretchers have banding. Okay, now let's look at our divider. Let me put a partition in next to it. So you can see the partition is using exterior banding. And so sometimes I'll treat the partition as like a exterior that goes all the way out to the case, make the divider more of an internal part that uses interior banding, because sometimes I want to set it back and just use it as an interior separator. Now this could go either way. You could obviously put exterior banding on both of these parts. I'm just showing you an example of how you could treat these two parts differently, because that's actually one of the big differences because that's really one of the main reasons that there are partitions and dividers. It gives you ability to quickly toggle in the section editor inside of the cabinet between two different parts that can be set up exactly the same, but you want to set them up differently so that you have a little more flexibility while you're inside the cabinet. So let's go to our divider question. And I want to put interior banding here. And there we go. So now you can see we kind of have this more internal part, whereas the partition is meant to come all the way to the face. So now if you were designing a cabinet, it's nice to know that, okay, well, if I want to make something that's kind of set back inside the cabinet, let's say it's pulled back 5 inches from the face, well, I really wouldn't want exterior banding there. So making this difference between partition and dividers makes it easy. Well, I can just say, I'll use a divider and then set that back, and then it's ready to go. So just little things like that can help you out at the cabinet level. Now, I mentioned you can add different types of banding. Right now we have exterior and interior, which is pretty basic, but works for most people. Let's go back to the main screen, and I'm going to go to part. I'm going to go to the banding section, and you can see my exterior and interior banding. And let's say I want to do, solid wood banding on adjustable shelves, for example. Probably not a very reasonable example, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. So when I click new banding, and I'm adding a new part type, and there was a video on this, but I didn't give a banding example, so I'm going to give a banding example in this video. So unlike other parts, for banding, you have to select from one of these pre-configured names. If I go to interior and add a part, it lets me name my part. but with banding, I need to pick one of the options. So what I'll do is, a lot of times I'll just find a letter that kind of corresponds with what I'm dealing with. So like, if I'm doing solid wood banding in this case, I'm going to use the S. So I'm just going to say solid wood banding. And I'm going to check that this gets exterior finish. And then you'll notice we have E for exterior, I for interior, and S for solid wood. And this comes into play if you use Label It and you put stickers on your parts, so your guys can see that this edge has S banding instead of E banding or whatever. Okay, so now we're prepped for solid wood banding, which doesn't do anything yet. But now if we go to material schedules, I have a new banding option here. And I really don't have any good solid banding, so I'm just gonna put some 3/4 solid cherry on here. Awesome. Now let's go into a job and see how we can use that. Because remember, adding new parts and assigning materials doesn't necessarily do anything just yet. We have to make Cabinet Vision know what to do with that new part. So let's go into a job. Let's get a wall cabinet. And we have our 2 shelves. So you can see there's not, weird solid wood banding right now. Let me just clear this out and get a fresh start. So right now I just have my 1mm edge banding that you can see there. But let's say I want to use solid wood edge banding on this construction method. So I'll go edit my construction method, go to adjustable shelves, and instead of interior banding, well, now I have this option. And now I can put an entire piece of 3/4 banding. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to get a solid board on the front. We can do UCSs and other things to get a little bullnose on the front of a shelf. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is the fact that if you find yourself limited by the exterior and interior banding, you can define these more special scenarios and assign it in the construction method. And with what we know already from this section, if you don't always want to do this, you could have a condition, and when that condition is true, then you could use that special edge banding. So hopefully that is helpful if you find yourself kind of limited by just the exterior and interior banding.